Staring down the scope, I kept my focus sharp. My target, a middle-aged, balding banker drenched in sweat, was too preoccupied with his latest office conquest to realize his world was about to end. He was a cliché in every sense, right down to the cheap hotel room where he conducted his sordid affairs. This job wasn't personal. It never was. Someone paid a hefty price to have him eliminated, and I don't ask questions. Cryptocurrency changed hands, and the contract appeared on the dark web. That's all I need to know. As far as I'm concerned, it's just business. I tracked his every movement through the scope, ensuring I'd have a clean shot when the moment came. Precision was my trademark. Timing mattered, too. And for this particular assignment, poetic justice demanded that his final breath coincide with his final pleasure. That irony never got old. The woman beneath him, young, blonde, and likely ambitious, was irrelevant to me. The contract made it clear she was not to be harmed. Fine by me, though she wouldn't walk away unscathed. Watching a man's head explode during an intimate moment tends to leave scars that don't heal. Before pulling the trigger, I check my surroundings. A sniper can't afford distractions or surprises. I work alone, so my safety depends on vigilance. My rooftop perch offered a perfect vantage point, and the area around me was secure. Satisfied, I returned to the scope just in time to see the banker nearing his climax. With practiced ease, I steadied my breathing, adjusted for the wind, and pulled the trigger. The suppressed rifle gave a muted pop, and the bullet found its mark. His body slumped instantly, leaving the woman beneath him to scream in shock. By the time her cries reached the street, I was already on the move, my escape route meticulously planned. I left nothing behind, not a shell casing, not a footprint. Within an hour, I'd stashed my gear in one of several prearranged locations around the city, each under a different alias. From there, I melted back into the crowd, just another face among many. Clean, efficient, professional, that's how I operate. As I made my way home, I reflected briefly on how I arrived at this life. Being a hitman wasn't a childhood dream, but I've always been good with a rifle. Growing up on a farm, I could hit a running deer from distances that would leave grown men slack-jawed. Joining the Marines honed those skills, and sniper school turned me into something of a legend. I didn't need fancy calculations. Instinct guided my shots. But skill alone doesn't explain why I specialize in eliminating adulterers. That choice stems from experience, specifically betrayal. And that betrayal has a name: Isabelle. Isabelle was a dark-haired beauty with a French accent and a dangerous smile. I met her during leave at a local bar, and she had every man in the room hanging on her every word. That night, my best friend Ethan and I both vied for her attention, but it was clear who she favored. Ethan, ever the charmer, swept her off her feet by the end of the night. I didn't mind. Ethan was a good man, and I had other priorities. Let him have her, I thought, and for a while, they seemed happy together. Every time we'd leave, they were inseparable. Occasionally, she'd flirt with me, but I brushed it off as harmless. Or so I thought. Whenever Isabelle joined Ethan for nights out, she often brought a friend along to keep me occupied. While they entertained each other, I humored her company. It was harmless enough. But when Ethan approached me only 3 months after meeting her, showing off an engagement ring, I couldn't help but question his judgment. "That's quite a rock," I said, examining the sizable diamond. "You sure about this?" Ethan grinned, striking a mock pose of an all-knowing sage. "When you know," he said, his confidence unwavering. I'm not letting her get away. I wanted to believe in his conviction, but when Ethan proposed that night at the bar, I noticed something unsettling. Isabelle's expression shifted momentarily, her eyes flashing with calculation before she plastered on the expected joy. It was subtle, quick enough that Ethan didn't see it. I kept my doubts to myself. It wasn't my place to interfere. As Ethan's best man, I took charge of organizing his bachelor party. It was a night to remember: buddies, booze, and beautiful women. Half the platoon turned out, and Ethan drank himself into oblivion. I ensured his virtues stayed intact, though the strippers made sure he had a good time. I'd spoken with Isabelle beforehand, asking for her boundaries. If she had objected to anything, I would have respected her wishes. After all, I wasn't going to let Ethan start his marriage with unnecessary trouble. The wedding itself was small but intimate, with a handful of her family, a few of her friends, and several guys from our unit. I stood beside Ethan as his best man, proud to see my friend so happy. But something about Isabel still nagged at me, a shadow I couldn't place. 2 months later, we deployed back to the desert for a 3-month tour. That deployment changed everything. I'll never forget the patrol that claimed Ethan's life. Our unit had intel suggesting insurgents were hiding in a nearby village. My spotter and I secured a vantage point, providing overwatch for the team. The location wasn't ideal, but it offered the best view available. Ethan had been acting out of character all day. He was uncharacteristically short-tempered, snapping at the guys and brushing off my questions. When I asked what was going on, he grinned and said, "I'm just ready to get this done." It didn't sit right with me. When the patrol made contact with the enemy, Ethan did something reckless. According to his team, he stood up in the open, shouting, "Come on, you bastards," before charging forward, firing his M16 from the hip. It wasn't bravery, it was suicide. He didn't make it 10 feet before they cut him down. As his best friend, I was tasked with packing up his belongings. That's when I found the letter. It was addressed to Ethan and written in Isabel's delicate handwriting. My jaw clenched as I read it. "Dear Ethan, I know this is a coward's way out, but I need to tell you that I've been seeing someone else. We've fallen in love, and I'm leaving you so we can be together. I want you to know that I did love you, but our time apart made me realize I'm not truly in love with you. You deserve someone who can love you the way you deserve. By the time you return, I'll have moved out of the house. I'm not asking for anything in the divorce. I'd like to remain friends if you can forgive me. Warmest regards, Isabel." Anger surged through me as I reread the letter. This wasn't just betrayal. It was cowardice of the highest order. Dropping a bombshell like that while Ethan was on active duty, she didn't just break his heart. She pushed him over the edge. When I returned stateside with Ethan's coffin, Isabel was waiting on the tarmac. Tears streamed down her face as she approached, her hand reaching for the coffin. I stepped forward, my voice cold and commanding. "Don't you dare touch it." She froze, her eyes wide with shock. That's when I noticed the man standing beside her, Colonel John Edwards. His arm rested around her shoulders, and everything clicked into place. The colonel had the audacity to address me first. "You're out of line, soldier," he barked. I didn't flinch. Out of line? I'm not the one who handed a Dear John letter to a man risking his life in a war zone. This woman, I spat, pointing at Isabel, is the reason he's dead. And you? I turned my glare to the colonel. You're just as guilty for standing here like this as some love story. Isabel opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. Save it. I don't want your excuses. You're not welcome here. Her lips trembled as she stepped back, retreating behind Edwards. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving them to their shame. Ethan deserved better, and one day, I'd make sure his story wasn't forgotten. What did she think was going to happen? That I'd just stand by silently, swallowing the betrayal? Not a chance. When I spotted Colonel Edwards at her side, I saw red. "Stand down, soldier," Edwards snarled, trying to assert his authority. I took a step forward, fists clenched. "She sent him a letter," I said, my voice cold and sharp. "A damn Dear John letter while he was on active duty. You knew about this." "I told her to wait," he began, but I cut him off. "You told her to wait? And you stepped out with one of your men's wives?" My voice was rising, and my words hit like bullets. "It's not what you think," he stammered, but I was done listening. My first punch hit him square in the throat, dropping him to his knees. Before he could recover, I drove a kick into his groin, and he collapsed completely. I didn't stop there. 4 punches to his face left him bloodied and sprawled on the ground before the MPs intervened, pulling me back. The aftermath was swift and unforgiving. Both of us were court-martialed. Edwards faced charges for conduct unbecoming, and I was sentenced to a year in military prison for assaulting a superior officer. A dishonorable discharge followed. Edwards lost his pension and his career, and as far as I was concerned, he got off lightly. I left the service with no regrets. I had settled the score in my own way. It took me another year to track her down. Isabel had fled to Canada, shacking up with some French-Canadian businessman. Edwards had disappeared from her life somewhere along the way. Not that I cared. She thought she could escape the consequences of her actions, but she was wrong. I considered simply ending her from a distance. A sniper shot from across the street. Clean, quick, no risk. It would have been easy. She was careless, walking around in public with no security. But that wasn't enough. She needed to see me, to know who was ending her life and why. I wanted her to understand the weight of her choices in her final moments. As it turned out, she made it almost too easy. One night, I spotted her at a bar with a group of friends, laughing and drinking as if she had no cares in the world. The man with his arm around her wasn't her French-Canadian businessman. She was still playing the same games. I followed them when they left, keeping my distance. They didn't even bother to find a motel. When he opened the back door of an SUV in the parking lot, I knew exactly what was about to happen. I waited, watching as she leaned into the car, her back arched over the seat. She was too preoccupied to notice me approaching. I didn't want to kill the man. He wasn't my target, and he didn't deserve to die for her sins. A quick chokehold left him unconscious on the ground. Isabel, oblivious to what had happened, eventually pulled herself out of the car and turned, only to find herself staring down the barrel of my Glock. Her eyes widened in recognition, and she opened her mouth to speak. I didn't give her the chance. "Ethan says hello," I said, my voice cold and final. 2 shots to the chest ended it. She crumpled into the car, lifeless. I was gone before the sound of gunfire brought anyone out of the bar, crossing the border back into the U.S. within hours. Avenging Ethan wasn't just justice. It was clarity. Her betrayal had given me purpose. How many others were suffering in silence, dealing with the humiliation of a cheating spouse? Some would forgive, others would move on, but there would always be those who wanted something more permanent. I had the skills, the experience, and now the motivation. It didn't take long for word to spread through the shadows. I became a hitman, specializing in eliminating adulterers. The work was straightforward. These weren't trained targets or high-security threats. They were ordinary people, utterly unprepared for the consequences of their actions. By the time I met Juliana, I had been in the business for 4 years and had amassed a small fortune. She was the finance manager at a car dealership, and our connection was immediate. She was tall, elegant, and striking, with jet black hair and a sharp wit that matched her beauty. Within 30 minutes of meeting her, I had a date. 18 months later, we were married in a lavish ceremony with over 200 guests. Her friends, family, my parents, and the few Marine buddies who still spoke to me. To Juliana and the world, I was a successful financial consultant who worked remotely. My real work, however, remained hidden in the shadows. Life with Juliana was steady and fulfilling. She was supportive of my so-called career as a money manager, which gave me the perfect cover for my real work. My occasional business trips around the country provided the necessary alibi for my assignments, and she never questioned my absences. When I returned, she welcomed me with unrestrained passion, her wild and uninhibited nature keeping things fresh. Even during the weeks when I wasn't traveling, our intimacy was frequent, 4 or 5 times a week, sometimes more. She never had the need to go out with the girls. If we went out, it was as a couple, and while she enjoyed dancing with other men occasionally, it was always within respectful boundaries. Juliana made sure that her actions passed what I called the husband test. I never doubted her loyalty or her love. Meanwhile, contracts continued to roll in. My clients communicated solely through the dark web, a method that ensured complete anonymity for both parties. I required irrefutable evidence of infidelity before accepting any contract. Once hired, I operated on my terms. Targets never knew when or where their judgment would come. Payments were handled through a virtual escrow system. The client deposited the agreed-upon amount, which would only be released after the job was completed. If I couldn't fulfill a contract, which hadn't happened yet, the funds would be returned. I worked cleanly and left no trail. Since I had no direct connection to my targets, law enforcement never even got close. Virtual currencies made transactions untraceable, ensuring my operation was airtight. Over the years, I discovered a fascinating pattern. Women hiring me to eliminate cheating husbands far outnumbered men seeking vengeance on unfaithful wives. by about 10-1. When men were betrayed, they usually wanted the other man dead, as if that would restore their pride. Women, however, went straight for the source of their pain. Cheaters, in my eyes, got exactly what they deserved, and I did my job without hesitation or guilt. For years, life moved forward. Juliana and I had 2 children. Our first after 3 years of marriage, and the second just 18 months later. They grew up in a stable, loving home, their college educations fully paid for by the money I had amassed. By the time they left for college, Juliana had become an empty nester and returned to her old job at the car dealership. I worked mostly from home, with only occasional business trips. I was ready to retire. 1 or 2 final contracts would top off the fund I'd been building for years, allowing me to walk away for good. Scanning the bulletin board where I picked up my jobs, I found 2 contracts available, 1 local and 1 across the country. The local contract paid enough to call it quits, so I clicked to accept. The target was a man named Peter Miller, a group insurance salesman who covered 3 states, including ours. His file revealed that he traveled extensively and had been married to his wife, Janine, for several years. Together, they had 3 children, Paul, Mary, and Siobhan. Included in the dossier were photographs of Peter with his family, a seemingly happy unit on the surface. But the private investigator's report told a different story. Peter had been having affairs with at least 4 women. The report indicated that he was currently on the road, staying in a hotel just 50 miles from my home. There was no definitive proof that he'd arranged to meet another woman during this trip, but it was strongly suspected. My instructions were clear. If he was caught with a woman who wasn't his wife, he wouldn't make it out of the hotel alive. The dossier included everything I needed: his current location, the hotel room he'd booked on the 5th floor, and even a detailed itinerary of his travels. I pulled up Google Earth to check the area and noticed a construction site 1 block over. The unfinished building offered an excellent vantage point, provided I could access a high enough floor. This job would be my finale. Clean, efficient, and lucrative, just the way I liked it. The construction site offered the perfect vantage point. From the 7th floor, I had an unimpeded view of the east side of the hotel. The lower buildings directly opposite were only 3 stories high, leaving my line of sight clear to Peter Miller's 5th floor room. Everything was in place. On Friday evening, I casually mentioned my plans to Juliana. "I've got a trip next week," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I'll leave Monday morning and be back by Thursday, maybe Friday." She looked up from the book she was reading, her curiosity piqued. "I thought you were done with those trips," she said, more observation than complaint. "This one might be the last," I replied. "Depends on how it goes. If it doesn't pan out, there may be one more." She nodded thoughtfully, then flashed me a grin. "So, we have the whole weekend together, then?" We didn't spend all of it in bed, though Friday night set a passionate tone. On Saturday, we took care of errands, indulging in the mundane comfort of shared routines, before dining at our favorite restaurant that evening. By Sunday, we were back in bed for most of the day, savoring the intimacy. Monday came quickly, and I left the house as planned. I parked my car at the airport, but didn't board any flights. Instead, I walked to a nearby storage unit where I kept a nondescript gray Toyota sedan. Registered under a fabricated identity, the car was a perfect cover, unassuming and unmemorable. It wouldn't hold up to deep scrutiny, but for everyday purposes, it was ideal. By midday, I was on the 7th floor of the construction site, my spotting scope trained on Peter Miller's hotel room. I watched him enter the room shortly after I set up. He moved about for a few minutes before answering a call and leaving in a hurry. I didn't bother following him. He would be back. These types always returned. The construction site was quiet. It seemed to be temporarily shut down, leaving me undisturbed. I settled in for the wait, watching the hotel across the way as the hours ticked by. Just after 6 p.m., Miller returned, looking rushed. He disappeared into the bathroom, presumably to shower. Through the scope, I observed him re-enter the room, towel slung over his shoulder. He was lean, but unimpressive, hardly the type to turn heads, unless he had a silver tongue to compensate. 30 minutes later, freshly dressed, he left again. I ate a quick meal and prepared for the long haul. It was a waiting game now. I was certain he'd return, likely with a companion. My camera was ready to capture proof of his infidelity, and my rifle was prepped for what came after. The contract didn't specify the woman's fate, so she wasn't part of my plan. Unless I had evidence she was knowingly involved with a married man, she wasn't my concern. It was after midnight when the room's lights came on again. Peering through the scope, I saw Miller return with a tall, dark-haired woman. As soon as the door closed, she shoved him against it and dropped to her knees. Her back was to me, so I couldn't see much of what was happening, but her head's rhythmic movements left little to the imagination. Within moments, his hands gripped her head, his hips moving in sync. They didn't linger at the door for long. Moving further into the room, they began shedding their clothes. By the time they reached the bed, she was left in her underwear, and he was completely naked. He pushed her onto the bed, his kisses trailing down her body. From my vantage point, a clean shot wasn't possible. The angle would have sent the bullet straight through him and into her. I waited. Timing was critical, and I preferred to act at the pinnacle of his pleasure. It added a poetic finality to the act. As they moved into position, I adjusted my scope to focus on their faces. At one point, she arched her back, throwing her head back in apparent ecstasy. That's when I froze, my finger tightening instinctively on the trigger. My heart raced as I stared at her face through the scope. I knew her. It took every ounce of control I had not to fire in that moment. Instead, I snapped a photo with my camera to confirm my suspicions. My mind reeled as I continued to observe, formulating a new plan. This wasn't just another job anymore. This was personal. The photos I took through the scope told the story I didn't want to face. For the next 3 hours, I documented everything: pictures, videos, evidence of their betrayal. I watched them, detached, as they indulged in each other like animals. Eventually, they seemed to tire, settling in a bed for one final session before drifting off to sleep. When the room lights went dark, I leaned back, my mind racing and my pulse pounding. I pulled up the first photo I'd taken. It was the moment she'd thrown her head back, her face contorted in pleasure. I zoomed in, focusing on her wide-open eyes, those unmistakable, beautiful eyes. The same ones that had looked into mine countless times, brimming with trust, warmth, and love. Juliana, my wife. The realization hit like a freight train, and my hand tightened around the phone. My immediate reaction was to end them both. It would have been easy. A single shot for each, clean and quick. But I stopped myself. Anger clouded my thoughts, and I couldn't make a decision in the heat of the moment. I had to think about the long-term consequences for me, for my children, for the life I had built. Killing her now would leave too many loose ends. Law enforcement would eventually connect me to her death, and no amount of planning could create a solid alibi. The safest part of my work had always been the lack of personal connection to the targets. This was different. If I acted rashly, the fallout would destroy everything. Worse, if I returned the contract, someone else might take it, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill her along with Miller. No, I had to complete the job. Miller's death needed to look accidental, natural, or at least untraceable. As for Juliana, she was a different problem. I had to confront her eventually, but not until I had full control of the situation. Packing up my kit, I left the construction site and returned to my storage unit. I wouldn't need the rifle for what I had planned. While there, I picked up additional electronics and tools. On my way back to the hotel, I located both their cars and discreetly attached GPS trackers to them. The next morning, they went their separate ways. Juliana back to my house, and Miller off to whatever business he was pretending to conduct. I used the time to gain access to Miller's hotel room, bypassing the lock with an electronic keycard spoofer. His luggage held no surprises: basic travel essentials, some blood pressure medication, and Viagra. I planted 2 hidden cameras in the room before leaving. For the rest of the day, I monitored their movements. Juliana's routine was painfully ordinary: work, gym, home. When Miller's tracker signaled he was heading toward my neighborhood, my anger surged. If she let him into our home, there would be no restraint, no planning, just vengeance. But he stopped several blocks short, turning away. By early evening, Juliana called me. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice cheerful and familiar. "Hi, honey. I replied, keeping my tone even. I missed you last night. I thought you were going to call. Sorry, she said without hesitation. I fell asleep in front of the TV, and by the time I woke up, it was too late. Her lie was smooth, but I caught it instantly. I figured as much. That's why I didn't disturb you, I said, clenching my fist under the table. This was the first time I'd known her to lie to me, though now I realized it couldn't have been the first time she'd done it. How's the trip? She asked, the question casual, almost routine. There was an unexpected complication, I said carefully. Someone turned up at the meeting uninvited. It's raised a few issues, but I'll sort it out. I listened to her voice, every word now laced with suspicion. The woman I'd trusted implicitly for years was suddenly a stranger. But I needed to keep my composure. I still had a job to finish, and there was plenty of time to deal with Juliana. That night, I reviewed the footage from the cameras I planted. Every detail would be recorded and analyzed. Miller wouldn't see it coming, and Juliana would never know what hit her life. Yet, I kept my voice steady as I responded to Juliana on the phone. This complication will take a little longer and might get a bit messy, I said, referring to the so-called business trip. So, you'll be back Friday instead of Thursday? She asked, her voice a mix of casual inquiry and something else, a flicker of guilt maybe. I could swear you don't sound too disappointed. I replied, letting a faint edge creep into my tone. Oh no, not at all, she countered quickly, smoothing over the moment. I'm just happy to hear that this will be your last trip. If an extra day makes it the last one, then it's worth it. Her quick recovery was almost impressive, but the lie beneath her words rang louder than ever. What are you up to tonight? I asked. I just got back from the gym, she said lightly. I'm going to veg out in front of the TV and have an early night. I have to work too, you know, she added with a laugh. Well, remember what my mother always said, I joked, trying to mask the bitterness simmering beneath the surface. If you're not in bed by 11, you have to go home. She laughed, oblivious to the barbed edge hidden in the humor. I'll call you tomorrow evening. I miss you. Good night. Good night, Jules, I replied, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I hung up before she could respond. Did she even notice the bitterness in my voice? Did she care? Back in Miller's hotel room, I logged into the hidden camera feed. His phone rang, and I heard his familiar tone. Hey, Jules, he said. The name hit me like a hammer. Juliana hated her name being shortened, yet here she was allowing him to call her that. It was a small thing, but it made everything worse. I watched as their conversation unfolded. His smug tone grated on me. No, baby, I didn't mean it. I know he's not, he said, clearly trying to backpedal after an earlier insult. No, Julie, please. He looked down at his phone, frustration flickering across his face. Whatever he'd said must have upset her, because he hadn't charmed her into staying the night. He sighed, pacing around the room. My phone rang. It was Juliana. Hey, babe, what's up? I asked, feigning surprise. Nothing. I just realized I didn't say I love you earlier. I wanted to make sure you knew, she said, her voice slightly strained. Was it guilt? Or was she trying to test the waters? You don't sound okay, I said, probing. Are you sure everything's fine? I'm fine, she said quickly. I just miss you, that's all. Her phone beeped, signaling another incoming call. I glanced at my computer and saw Miller on his phone again, likely trying to salvage the night. Why don't we chat for a while? I suggested. It'll be almost like I'm there. There was a pause. I waited, curious to see what she would choose. She chose wrong. No, I'm just being silly. Listen, my mom is trying to ring me. I just wanted to tell you I love you. Good night. Good night, Jules, I replied again, letting the name linger. I hung up, knowing she was already switching over to Miller's call. Back on the camera feed, I heard him pick up. Hey, babe. Yes, I'm really sorry about earlier. I know you don't like it when I talk smack about him. It's just my insecurities. I want to be the best for you. No, I won't. Tomorrow, then? I clenched my jaw as I watched him fawn over her. He had no idea I was listening, documenting his every word and movement. Soon this would all come to an end. After the call, Miller ordered room service and settled down with his meal. It was time for me to make my move. I waited for the delivery staff to leave before approaching his door. A light knock was enough to draw him out. He opened the door without even checking the peephole, his eyes widening as he stared down the barrel of my silenced Glock. "Evening, Peter," I said, my tone casual but cold. "May I come in?" He backed away instinctively, his mouth working silently as I stepped into the room and closed the door behind me. "What do you want?" "I've got $500 in my wallet." "You can have it," he stammered. I smirked. "Nothing so crass. I just want to have a nice, friendly chat." I stepped closer, watching as he shrank back into a chair. "You see, my employer, your wife, Janine, has some questions, and you're going to provide the answers." I pulled a beer from the minibar, popping the cap and taking a swig before handing another to him. "You lie to me, and I'll know. And if you lie to me, I'll shoot you. Simple as that." His face paled, and he nodded quickly. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice shaking. I leaned back, taking another drink. "Let's start with Juliana." Peter squirmed in his chair, his nervous energy spilling over as I leaned back, beer in hand. "Juliana," he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. He was trying to gauge how much I knew, but his face betrayed him. "Yes, Juliana," I said coolly. "The one you've been sneaking around with for the past 4 months? You know, the one who happens to be my wife." His eyes widened, and his mouth opened, but no words came out. I let the silence hang, savoring the tension. "Start talking, Peter," I said, my tone firm but calm. "How did it start? How long has it been going on? Spare me the poetic nonsense. Just the facts." He stammered for a moment before the words started tumbling out. "I met her at the car dealership. She was working on the financing for an insurance package I was selling. We hit it off immediately. She was charming, beautiful, confident. I asked her to lunch after our meeting, and she agreed." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "That same night, we went to dinner. She told me her husband was out of town, and we ended up back at my hotel. I swear, she made the first move." I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "And you, being the upstanding gentleman you are, just couldn't say no." He flinched at the sarcasm, but pressed on. "It just kept happening. Every time her husband went on a trip, she'd call me. I'd rearrange my schedule to see her. She was," he hesitated, searching for the right words, "different, amazing, better than any other woman I've ever been with." I set my beer down, my patience wearing thin. "How often?" 8 or 9 times, he admitted. "Maybe more. She called, I came. Simple as that." "In protection?" I asked pointedly. He shook his head. "She said she was on the pill." I didn't think. "Of course you didn't," I said, cutting him off. "And STDs? Did it ever cross your mind that she might bring something back to her husband? Or that you, with your parade of women, might give her something to bring home?" Peter winced and looked away, rubbing his chest absently. "I get tested regularly," he muttered. "I'm clean." "That's comforting," I said flatly. "For now." Peter suddenly winced again, his hand clutching his chest tighter this time. Sweat beaded on his forehead as his breathing became labored. His free hand moved to rub his left arm, his face contorted in pain. "What's the matter, Peter?" I asked, my tone mockingly solicitous. "Indigestion? Or maybe something more serious?" His eyes widened in fear. "Help me," he gasped, his voice barely audible. His face turned purple, and his body began to tremble. I leaned forward, meeting his terrified gaze. "You should have stayed away from Juliana," I said, my voice low and calm. His eyes widened further in shock, and for a moment I thought he might lunge at me. But the fight drained from him as he collapsed, unconscious, clutching his chest. I checked his pulse. It was weak, erratic. He wouldn't last long. I had planned for this. I used the next 10 minutes to ensure the room was spotless. The hidden cameras had recorded everything I needed, and I wiped down any surface I'd touched. I turned on the TV at a low volume and moved his untouched meal in front of him. When the scene was discovered, it would appear as if he'd suffered a fatal heart attack while eating dinner. His pre-existing heart condition, combined with his medications and lifestyle, would make it an open and shut case. Once I was satisfied, I placed the Do Not Disturb sign on the door handle and slipped out. By the time anyone found him, I'd be long gone. The next day, Juliana called me, her voice cheerful and upbeat. "Hey, babe, how's it going?" "Remarkably well," I replied smoothly. I resolved one of the issues, and I'm confident the last one will be done soon. That's great, she said enthusiastically. I was thinking, since this is your last trip, maybe we could celebrate. How about a weekend at the coast? Just you and me. I pretended to consider it. Sounds like a plan. Let's book the flights tomorrow. Perfect, she said. I'll talk to my boss in the morning. Later that evening, I watched the feed as a knock came on Peter's hotel room door. The maid hadn't serviced the room due to the Do Not Disturb sign, and I recognized Juliana's silhouette. When there was no answer, she returned with a hotel employee. Together, they entered the room and found Peter slumped over, his face in the remains of his last meal. Is he dead? Juliana asked flatly, her tone devoid of emotion. The employee checked for a pulse, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. He's dead. Without another word, Juliana turned and left, disappearing before the employee could stop her. By the time the authorities arrived, the story had already begun to take shape. A man with a history of heart problems had died in his room. No foul play. No loose ends. When I picked Juliana up for our weekend getaway, she greeted me with a bright smile. But when I called her Jules, her expression faltered. You know I hate that name, she said sharply. Why? I asked, meeting her gaze. You didn't seem to mind when Peter used it. Her face went pale, and she froze. Who's Peter? She asked, trying to play dumb. You know who? The man you've been sleeping with for the past 4 months. I pulled an 8x10 photo from my bag and placed it on the table. Her eyes widened as she recognized herself in the image. Her back arched, her face flushed with pleasure. Oh, she said softly, sinking into her chair. So, what now? Juliana sat across from me, her face pale but composed, the weight of the conversation sinking in. She took a sip of the wine I had poured for her, swirling the glass nervously in her hands. So, what now? She repeated, her voice quieter, almost tentative. I leaned back in my chair, holding my glass as if it were the only thing tethering me to calmness. Now, I said slowly, you explain everything. And I mean everything. Spare me the justifications and the excuses. I want the unvarnished truth. Juliana exhaled deeply, setting the glass down on the table. I thought I already explained, she said cautiously. But fine, I'll lay it all out for you. I did it because I couldn't handle the gaps, the absences. You were gone for weeks, sometimes months, and I couldn't do it. I've told you before, it wasn't about love or emotion. It was physical, a way to get through the times when you weren't here. I took a sip of my wine, letting her words settle. And that's supposed to make it better? Knowing you turned to other men because you couldn't control yourself. It wasn't about control, she snapped, her frustration breaking through. You think I wanted this? You think I enjoyed sneaking around, lying to you, and feeling guilty every time I looked at you when you came home? I hated it, but I couldn't stop. I didn't know how. You didn't want to stop, I said coldly. That's the difference. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she looked away, staring at the wall as if searching for the right words. Maybe you're right, she admitted finally. Maybe part of me didn't want to stop, but I never stopped loving you. Not for a second. Love, I said, my voice rising. You call this love? You've spent years lying to me, betraying me, and endangering everything we built together. And you still think that's love? Juliana flinched but held her ground. Yes, I do. Because despite everything, you were always the center of my world. The other men, they were placeholders, tools to get me through the time you were gone. But you, she paused, her voice softening. You were everything. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You've got a twisted way of showing it. Silence fell between us, heavy and suffocating. She picked up her glass again, draining it in one long swallow. Her hand trembled as she set it down, and she rubbed her left arm absently. I noticed the faint sheen of sweat on her forehead and the way her breathing had grown, slightly labored. You're not feeling well? I observed, my tone flat. Juliana looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. What do you mean? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Peter felt the same way. It started with some discomfort, rubbing his arm a little short of breath. And then it got worse, much worse. Her eyes widened as the realization hit her. What did you do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "The same thing I did to him," I said evenly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I gave you something to think about, something to feel." She pushed back from the table, panic rising in her expression. You poisoned me?" "Not poison," I corrected. "That would have been too messy. This is more precise." Juliana clutched her chest, her breathing growing more labored by the second. "You can't do this," she gasped. "We have children. They need me." "They needed a mother who respected their father," I said coldly, "not someone who lied and cheated for years." She tried to stand, but her legs gave out, and she collapsed back into the chair. "Please," she begged, her voice barely audible. "Don't do this." I stood, walking around the table to tower over her. "You made your choices, Juliana. Now you live or die with them." Her eyes fluttered shut, her breathing shallow and erratic. I watched as she slumped forward, her body going limp. For a long moment, I stood there, watching, waiting, until I was certain she was gone. I finished the wine in her glass, savoring the quiet. The villa was silent now, save for the gentle rustle of the breeze outside. I took my time cleaning up, wiping down every surface, ensuring no trace of my presence remained. When I was done, I walked out onto the veranda, staring out at the ocean as the sun dipped below the horizon. This was it, the end of a chapter, the closing of a story that had unraveled in ways I never anticipated. Juliana was gone, and with her, the weight of years of betrayal and deceit. I would leave the villa that night, returning home to a life rebuilt from the ashes of what she had destroyed. The children would grieve, but I would ensure they never learned the truth. To them, she would remain the loving mother they knew, untarnished by the darkness she had brought into our lives. As for me, I would start over, a new life, a clean slate, and I would never look back.